Over the skies of North Vietnam, American aircraft were disappearing. Not to MiGs, not to flak. Something was reaching up from the ground and tearing them apart. In the months that followed the first shoot-down, the losses kept mounting, and the United States Air Force had no tactics to dodge it and no way to fight back. The weapon responsible was the SA-2 Guideline surface-to-air missile, 35 feet long, 5,000 pounds, capable of climbing at nearly 4 times the speed of sound. The so-called flying telephone pole was so fast that most never saw it coming. Its Fansong radar could grab onto an aircraft miles away and guide the missile straight into it without a warning. But what made it particularly devastating was the way the North Vietnamese deployed it. Each SAM site had 5 or 6 launchers arranged in a 6-pointed star pattern around a central radar van. The North Vietnamese could pack the entire site up and have it operational somewhere else in 6 hours. With the aid of their Soviet advisors, these sites were built in overlapping rings around Hanoi, each one positioned to cover the gaps left by the others. Climb too high to avoid one site, and the next one opened fire. Drop low to break the radar lock, and the anti-aircraft guns waiting below would tear the aircraft apart. Washington had been watching this missile for years. In 1960, it brought down CIA pilot Francis Gary Powers in his U-2 over the Soviet Union, pulling him out of the sky from 70,000 feet and setting off an international crisis. 2 years later, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the same missile took out another U-2. In the spring of 1965, despite the American reconnaissance flights having photographed Soviet technicians building SA-2 sites outside Hanoi, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara refused to allow the Air Force to destroy the still under construction installations, worried that bombing Soviet personnel on the ground would drag Moscow into the war. Now, only 6 weeks after that assessment, the once unfinished missiles he had refused to touch were causing absolute mayhem. 3 days after the first incident, the Air Force sent a retaliatory strike to destroy the site responsible. But by the time the F-105 Thunderchiefs arrived, the SAM batteries had packed up and moved, replaced by dummy missiles and concealed anti-aircraft guns positioned around them. The Americans flew straight into the trap, and 4 aircraft went down before anyone knew what was happening. Now, with American dominance of the skies abruptly over, the Air Force had to do something about it, and fast. The solution from the Pentagon was unlike anything the Air Force had attempted before: become the bait. That summer, a small classified program called Project Weasel was established at a remote corner of Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. Instead of avoiding the SA-2, specially equipped aircraft would fly directly toward it, let the enemy radar lock onto them, follow that signal back to its source, and destroy the site, all before the missile already in the air had a chance to reach them. The Weasels were bait by design. As Leo Thorsness, who would go on to lead the Weasels at Tuckley, described it, quote, "In essence, we would go in high enough to let somebody shoot at us, and low enough to go down and get them." These Wild Weasels would fly out ahead of a strike package of F-105 Thunderchiefs, which would follow behind and finish off whatever they found. To fly these sorties, the Air Force needed volunteers, and the recruits made for an unusual mix. The pilots were experienced aviators from the F-100 Super Sabres community, comfortable with fast jets and aggressive flying. But the electronic warfare officers who would ride in the back seat and operate the detection equipment were pulled from a completely different world. Most of them had thousands of hours inside B-52 bombers, enormous 8-engine aircraft where the whole point was to stay as far from danger as possible. Now, these radar and electronic specialists were being asked to strap themselves into the back of a small fighter and go hunting for missiles. Many were recruited without being told what the job actually was. A colonel would approach a man, hand him orders, and only once he had arrived at Eglin would the details be laid out in full. One of those men was Captain Jack Donovan, a veteran of B-52 operations, who, when everything was explained to him, responded immediately, quote, "You want me to fly in the back of a little tiny fighter aircraft with a crazy fighter pilot who thinks he's invincible, home in on a SAM site in North Vietnam, and shoot it before it shoots me? You gotta be shitting me." The name stuck, and YGBSM became the official motto of the Wild Weasels, worn on the patch of every crew member. The Wild Weasels arrived at the war with a plan, but North Vietnam was already one step ahead. On Thanksgiving Day, 1965, the first 5 crews touched down at Korat Royal Thai Air Force Base, with Major Gary Willard, who directed the program at Eglin, with them. Now, they had roughly 3 months to prove the concept worked. Their aircraft of choice was the North American F-100 Super Sabre. Modified quickly for the mission, engineers stripped radar homing and warning equipment from CIA U-2 spy planes and bolted it onto the model, alongside a launch warning detector that would alert the crew the instant a missile left its launcher on the ground. The first sorties lifted off from Thailand into North Vietnamese airspace. EWOs in back seats, scanning their equipment, headsets on, waiting for what they called the rattlesnake, a distinctive crackling sound that meant a Fansong radar had found them and was tracking. This one-of-a-kind sound would tighten as the sight locked on, then shift to a solid and unwavering tone when a missile was already climbing toward them, giving the crews roughly 75 seconds to find the site and destroy it first. However, nothing was happening. As it turned out, North Vietnamese radar operators were watching every mission come in, tracking the formations optically. Well aware that the moment a Fansong transmitted, it gave the Weasels a signal to follow straight back to the site, they kept their equipment dark, letting the Americans fly overhead. Week after week, the sorties went up and came back with nothing to show for it. The Weasels were bait. North Vietnam simply wasn't taking it just yet. The Wild Weasels had been flying into North Vietnam for weeks and hadn't touched a single SAM site. Then, in the space of 2 days, everything changed. On December 20th, 1965, Captain John Pitchford and EWO Captain Robert Trier climbed into their F-100 Super Sabre at Korat Air Base and flew north on their 3rd combat mission. But before there was any sign that something on the ground had found them, heavy 100mm anti-aircraft fire found them first, tearing through the airframe before either man knew what had hit them. Pitchford and Trier punched out, their ejection seats firing them clear of the disintegrating jet, parachutes snapping open. Pitchford came down and was captured almost immediately, spending the next 7 years as a prisoner of war. Trier landed in the jungle and ran, but did not make it far. The program was not even a month old, and already had its first casualty. Only 2 days later, Captain Al Lamb and Captain Jack Donovan, the man who inspired the elite team's motto, climbed into their F-100F at Korat and flew north, leading 4 F-105 Thunderchiefs toward a rail yard northwest of Hanoi, 75 miles inside North Vietnam, deeper than any Weasel crew had gone before. After refueling over Laos, the formation dropped to 300 feet as it crossed into North Vietnamese airspace, low enough that the hills and ridgelines masked their approach, hugging the ground as they pushed northeast toward Hanoi. Then, about 100 miles from the target, Donovan's equipment picked up a signal. At last, after weeks of silence, the rattlesnake was in their headsets. Lamb kept the aircraft low, popping up briefly every few miles to let Donovan get a fresh directional fix on the signal, then dropping back down into the terrain. Each time they came up, the signal was stronger. The pilot then pulled the nose up, rolled the F-100F inverted, and looked down at the ground below him. Under a cluster of thatched roofing, arranged to look like an ordinary rural structure, he could see 3 long white missiles lying in their launch configuration. He rolled upright, lined up, and fired. When the rockets landed short, he came back around with the 20mm cannon and put rounds directly into the sight. One of the missiles cooked off in a massive yellow-orange fireball, thick black smoke boiling up through the jungle canopy, marking the position for the F-105s behind him. The thuds then rolled in, one after another, rockets and cannon fire tearing what was left apart. As Lamb and Donovan returned to their quarters, the Wild Weasels finally had something to celebrate. The concept worked. That evening, a message was sent to the Pentagon that read, quote, "Wild Weasel sighted SAM site, destroyed same." The North Vietnamese had spent weeks keeping their radars dark to protect their sights. Then the Weasels figure out how to use that against them. During missions, pilots began turning toward suspected SAM sites, whether they had loaded weapons or not, knowing the enemy would shut their equipment down rather than give their position away. Then, with the radar dark and the missiles blind, the bombers following behind would be able to pass through uncontested, drop their payloads, and make it back to base safely. The site was still standing, but the bombers had done their mission. Whenever the missiles did launch, some crews developed a technique they called dancing with the SAMs. The move was to fly straight at the incoming missile, hold course until the last possible moment, then yank the aircraft into the sharpest turn possible. The SA-2 couldn't match that kind of abrupt directional change at close range, and would overshoot wide. None of these moves ever became official doctrine or manual. Instead, crews worked it out over North Vietnam and passed it to each other on the ground. Operating entirely on improvisation, the Wild Weasels had one of the most dangerous jobs in the entire war. The casualty rate among the original crews reached roughly 50% within the first few months, the highest loss rate of any mission type in the war. According to Colonel George Acree, who went on to fly more than 200 missions over North Vietnam, his fellow Weasel pilots, quote, "were some of the bravest men I ever met." In a cockpit that small, with odds that bad, the pilot and EWO had no choice but to become something closer than friends. One of these duos, Captain Stan Goldstein and his pilot John Wevack, paired up in Wild Weasel School and never separated. They flew every single one of their 100 missions together in 1968. The same aircraft, the same seats, the same rattlesnake in their headsets. At 50% casualties, a full tour was something most crews never saw. Goldstein and Wevack saw all of it, side by side, and came home. Faced with these numbers, the Air Force was not standing still. The F-100F Super Sabre was too slow, consistently struggling to keep pace with the F-105 Thunderchiefs it was supposed to be leading, forced to weave an S-turn just to avoid overtaking them, burning fuel and compromising the formation every single mission. The solution was a two-seat variant of the F-105 Thunderchief, a single-engine supersonic fighter bomber that had already conducted over 75% of all Air Force bombing strikes in Vietnam. It was fast, tough, and could carry a weapons load the F-100F could not come close to matching. Engineers stripped out the instructor equipment and replaced it with the detection gear the original Weasels had proven in combat, plus added the wiring for a new weapon that was coming out of development at exactly the right moment, the AGM-45 Shrike. Every Weasel crew flew, knowing their missile couldn't reach the thing trying to shoot them down. Major Leo Thorsness decided that wasn't acceptable. The AGM-45 Shrike, the first missile ever designed specifically to hunt radar, was meant to lock on to the Fun Song's emissions and ride that signal all the way back to the source. In practice, it was deeply flawed. The Shrike could only guide itself as long as the radar kept transmitting. The moment a North Vietnamese operator shut the Fun Song down, the missile lost its reference point and continued on a ballistic trajectory toward the last known direction of the signal, hitting nothing. Operators figured this out fast, turning the Fun Song off the instant it detected a Shrike launch, waiting for it to pass harmlessly overhead, then switching it back on. It also had an effective range of roughly 7 miles, while the SA-2, which it was designed to hunt, could reach out from 17, meaning every mission the Weasels flew, they were operating inside a 10-mile deficit, forced to close within range of something that could bring them down before their own weapon could reach its target. In the first 3 months of Shrike employment, American crews fired 107 of them over North Vietnam and recorded only a single confirmed hit. Though their new F-105F Thunderchiefs carrying it were better than what came before, the losses kept coming. The first 11 arrived in May 1966, 7 more followed in July, and within 6 weeks, every single one of those 7 had been brought down. Like always, the Wild Weasels knew just how to adapt. After flying that 10-mile deficit on every mission, Major Leo Thorsness and his EWO, Captain Harry Johnson, worked out something nobody else had tried before. Thorsness would push the F-105F to full afterburner, climb to 35,000 feet, and then pull the nose up to 45 degrees, hanging at the top of a steep arc on the edge of a stall. The moment the aircraft peaked, he fired the Shrike. The air at that altitude is so thin, it barely slows a missile down, and the Shrike left the rail already carrying the full speed and momentum of an aircraft in afterburner at the top of a steep climb. With almost nothing to slow it down, it covered ground that a level shot from low altitude could never reach, effectively turning the 7-mile range into 35. Now, the Weasel crews were hitting SAM sites before those sites could fire back. Meanwhile, with more than 100 SAM sites ringed around Hanoi alone, the North Vietnamese were constructing them faster than the Weasels could destroy them. Without enough Weasel aircraft to fill the slots, regular F-105s without detection equipment started flying in their place. The men leading the most dangerous missions of the war were doing it chronically short of everything they needed. A full Wild Weasel combat tour was 100 missions, and the saying among F-105 pilots was, quote, "By your 66th mission, you'll have been shot down twice and picked up once." April 19th, 1967, marked Thorsness' 93rd mission over North Vietnam, just 7 missions shy of going home. Over the target area, Thorsness' formation came under attack. His wingman's F-105 took a hit and went down, both crew members ejecting into the North Vietnamese countryside, with enemy soldiers already closing in below. Rescue helicopters were inbound, but needed time, and a formation of MiG-17s circling overhead was not going to give it to them. Thorsness looked at his fuel gauge, then at his weapons load, and made a decision. He and EWO Johnson were alone, deep inside the most heavily defended airspace in the world, with dwindling fuel and a rescue operation on the ground that had no one else to protect it. He pushed the throttle forward and went after the MiGs. Flying an F-105F that had not been designed for air-to-air combat, Thorsness went after every MiG-17 that came near those helicopters. He shot one down. Right after this, he pulled hard after another and put enough rounds into it to drive it out of the fight. When he had nothing left on his pylons, he kept making passes anyway, pointing the nose of a fully empty aircraft directly at incoming MiGs and closing the distance fast enough that their pilots had to make a decision: hold their course against something that might still be armed, or break away. Time and time again, they broke away. As it turned out, the bluff that had worked against radar operators for 2 years worked just as well against MiG pilots. Then, down in the jungle, the 2 men who'd been on the ground in hostile territory, listening to MiGs overhead and soldiers moving through the trees, watched a Sikorsky come in low through the canopy and let out a sigh of relief. The duo sprinted across open ground, threw themselves in, and the helicopter climbed out of North Vietnam with them inside, all thanks to Thorsness, who'd bought them that with an empty aircraft and nothing but nerve. When Thorsness and Johnson landed back at Korat that evening, the Air Force began processing the paperwork for the Medal of Honor, the highest military honor the U.S. could award. However, 2 weeks after April 19th, on May 30th, 1967, their aircraft was shot down over North Vietnam, and Thorsness and Johnson would have to spend the next 6 years as prisoners of war in Hanoi. By 1968, the Shrike was already being phased out. The AGM-78 Standard anti-radiation missile was faster, carried a larger warhead, and had nearly 4 times the range. From March 1968 on, it steadily replaced the Shrike on Weasel aircraft, giving crews a weapon that could finally match the threat they'd been flying against for 3 years. But the Weasels were not just fighting the North Vietnamese. They were fighting their own rules of engagement. As Thorsness put it, quote, "We could not, however, hit the SAMs that were unloaded and stacked in rows at Haiphong Harbor. Sometimes the Russian ship was still unloading, but we could not touch the ship or the SAMs. Stupid war." The bombing halt of that year pulled the Weasels back. Missions continued, but restricted, escorting reconnaissance flights in the south, operating under rules that often prevented them from firing even when locked on. For 4 years, the war they had been building for went quiet. Then, in April 1972, a North Vietnamese force crossed the demilitarized zone. The bombing of the North was back on. By then, Washington was out of patience. In April, President Nixon ordered unrestricted bombing of North Vietnam resumed under Operation Linebacker, and the Weasels were pushed harder than at any point since the program began. Some crews flew 4 missions a day, all while ground crews worked through the night to keep the aircraft serviceable. Then, on December 18th, Nixon ordered Linebacker 2. For the next 11 consecutive nights, B-52 Stratofortresses, the 8-engine strategic bombers built to carry nuclear weapons across the Arctic and into the Soviet Union, would fly over Hanoi in continuous waves, dropping enough bombs to level entire city blocks until North Vietnam came to the negotiating table. As always, Wild Weasels flew first on every single mission. By then, there were 28 F-105Gs in theater, joined by a new squadron of F-4C Phantoms that had just arrived from Kadena Air Base in Japan. Together, they pushed into the SAM corridors around Hanoi, teaming with F-4E fighter bombers to hit SAM sites, radar bands, and launchers with cluster bombs and cannon fire. Throughout the operation, North Vietnamese fired 4,244 missiles at American aircraft and brought down 15 B-52s. However, it was not the Weasels' fault, but the Strategic Air Command, which sent the B-52s over Hanoi on identical routes, at identical altitudes, at identical times, night after night. Linebacker 2 ended on December 29, 1972. It was the last major combat mission the F-105 Thunderchief ever flew. The aircraft that had carried the Weasel program through its bloodiest years, ending its combat life over the same city where so many of its crews had gone down. Less than a month later, on January 27, 1973, North Vietnam signed the Paris Peace Accords, and the war, for American air crews at least, was over. When Leo Thorsness came home, he spent 6 years as a prisoner of war in Hanoi. He had no idea that while he was there, the United States had awarded him the Congressional Medal of Honor for what he had done alone over North Vietnam on April 19, 1967. A total of 46 Weasel F-105s and 2 Weasel F-100Fs were lost in combat. The Soviet Union had supplied North Vietnam with 98 SA-2 systems and 7,500 missiles over the course of the conflict. The Wild Weasels had helped grind through more than half of all of it. But the numbers do not capture what the program actually produced, a completely new technique for American warfare. Instead of retiring the Wild Weasel concept, ever since Vietnam, every major air campaign the U.S. has fought has opened the same way, with specially equipped aircraft going in ahead of everything else to clear the path. The aircraft evolved with each conflict, from the F-105G to the F-4G Phantom, and eventually to the single-seat F-16 CJ Fighting Falcon, where one pilot now performs both the flying and the hunting simultaneously. The wars themselves evolved as well, from the jungles of Vietnam to the deserts of Iraq in 1991, to Kosovo, to Baghdad in 2003. Despite the different terrain, different enemies, and different technology, the doctrine that the volunteers developed from scratch at Eglin Air Force Base in the summer of 1965 never changed. To this day, the pilots climbing into F-16s wear the same patch every Weasel crew has worn since Jack Donovan said it out loud in a briefing room at Eglin in 1965. 5 letters: YGBSN.